General Hospital spoilers reveal that Carly had always believed that her protective instincts were sharper than most, honed by years of surviving betrayal, loss, and the constant chaos that accompanied life in Port Charles. But now, with Sasha stepping deeper into Michael's world and into the lives of Wiley, Amelia, and Daisy, those instincts had turned into something far more consuming, suspicion laced with dread. On the surface, Sasha wore the mask of maternal grace and redemption well. She co-parented peacefully, spoke gently, and maintained a soft-spoken distance from drama. But Carly didn't buy it. Beneath that facade, Carly sensed the lingering influence of Nina, an influence that had once driven Sasha to participate in elaborate lies, including the most infamous one, pretending to be Nina's long-lost daughter. That deception had not only hurt Nina but had rippled through the entire Corinthos family, poisoning trust, destabilizing relationships, and setting off a chain of emotional upheaval. And Carly knew better than anyone that old lies never stayed buried, they metastasized, mutated, and waited to re-emerge at the worst possible moment. Now, Carly found herself watching Sasha through a sharper lens, questioning her every smile, every word, every moment she spent alone with the children. She began recalling how Sasha had once spiraled into addiction after losing her own child, how grief had nearly consumed her whole. And now she had Daisy, a beautiful, innocent little girl born from a chaotic tangle of relationships, betrayal, and shifting loyalties. Carly couldn't ignore the parallels. She couldn't ignore the fact that Sasha's re-entry into Michael's life had come at the exact moment Willow was unraveling and that Sasha's role had expanded just as Nina's presence had begun to fade. Were they replacing one manipulator with another? Was Sasha a pawn, or was she playing her own game? Her concern deepened when she began noticing subtle behavioral shifts in Wiley and Amelia. Amelia, always sensitive and intuitive, had started pulling away from Sasha, sometimes hiding behind Michael or even resisting contact. Wiley, though older and more guarded, had shown signs of confusion, once calling Sasha "Mom" in front of Willow, a moment that sent shockwaves through the fractured family. Carly had seen it all unfold from the sidelines. And what she saw was enough to make her act. She began asking questions, probing Sasha about her past mental health treatment, about her ties to Nina, about why she hadn't spoken up when Drew had manipulated the family so recklessly. Sasha, to her credit, remained composed, too composed. It was that eerie calm that unnerved Carly the most. It reminded her of someone waiting for the storm to hit, not trying to prevent it. Michael, torn between loyalty to his mother and his desire to believe in the woman raising his child, began to feel the pressure mounting. He didn't want to doubt Sasha. He didn't want to reopen old wounds or question his decisions. But even he couldn't deny that Sasha had moments of detachment, moments when her eyes seemed far away. When she would hold Daisy just a little too tightly or linger in the nursery long after the child had fallen asleep. Carly pointed these things out to him not as attacks, but as warnings. "Watch her," she whispered. "Watch how close she lets herself get." The tension between Carly and Sasha began to crackle like dry kindling. At family dinners, the silence between them stretched longer. During custody transitions, the polite small talk dissolved into thinly veiled challenges. Carly would ask questions like, "Has Daisy been sleeping through the night?" Or, "You remembered to double-check her medication schedule, right?" They were framed as maternal concern, but Sasha heard the implications beneath them loud and clear. "I don't trust you. I don't think you're stable. I think you might hurt my grandchildren." And then came the day when Carly saw Sasha and Nina talking behind the Metro court, just a few feet from where Daisy was napping in her stroller. It wasn't a confrontation, but an exchange, a moment of intimacy that reignited every fear Carly had buried. What if Sasha was still under Nina's thumb? What if the entire redemption arc was a performance, a soft reintroduction into a family Sasha was planning to destabilize? Carly snapped a photo of the encounter, and later that night, she showed it to Jason, her silent partner in all things protective. "She's not clean of Nina," she said. "She never was." Jason didn't respond immediately, but his expression told her he was listening. That was enough for Carly to act. She began pushing Michael again, urging him to renegotiate the parenting plan. To insist on evaluations, even to consider supervised visitation. Michael resisted at first, but then Amelia had a nightmare and screamed Sasha's name. When he asked her why, the little girl simply said, she was mad. That was the moment something shifted in Michael, when Carly's fears began to take root in him, too. Now, a quiet war was being waged. Sasha, unaware of the full scope of Carly's suspicion, could sense something had changed. Michael grew more withdrawn. Carly hovered more aggressively. Daisy's routines became stricter, more monitored. What had once felt like a fragile but healing alliance was fracturing, and Sasha was beginning to feel it in every corner of her life. This wasn't just tension. It was the beginning of a reckoning. And for Carly, who had always fought to protect her family no matter the cost, the battlefield had been drawn. Sasha was no longer just the mother of Michael's child. She was a threat. An echo of a betrayal that had already harmed too many people. And Carly would not let history repeat itself, not while Wiley, Amelia, and Daisy's futures hung in the balance. Sasha was spiraling into a storm she never saw coming, and the chaos surrounding her was no longer just emotional, it was strategic, calculated, and closing in on every side. What began as a fragile hope for redemption had now mutated into a waking nightmare, one that cast her in the harshest possible light. Her every movement, every maternal instinct toward Daisy, was being dissected and questioned, not by strangers, but by the one person whose silent authority could unravel everything, Carly. The air between them had grown unbearably tense. Each interaction weighted with unspoken accusations and veiled ultimatums. But nothing could have prepared Sasha for the shock of the direct confrontation that Carly now brought to her doorstep. A cold, resolute ultimatum that left no room for doubt. Michael would be seeking full custody of Daisy. And Carly, ever the protector, would do everything in her power to ensure it. It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration of war. The psychological impact of Carly's attack wasn't immediate, but once the words took root, they fractured something inside Sasha. Her mind, already burdened with the weight of past trauma and a desperate need to prove herself, began to unravel at the seams. Carly's accusations echoed louder than Sasha's own heartbeat. She was being labeled unstable, unfit, dangerous. And worse, she could see in Michael's eyes the flicker of hesitation, the terrifying possibility that he might believe it. Carly had painted a narrative that weaponized Sasha's past, the drug overdose, the hallucinations, the erratic behavior after Liam's death, and now twisted it into a present-day threat. To Carly, Sasha wasn't a mother fighting for her child. She was a ticking bomb. And to Sasha, this betrayal felt like her entire world was being stolen all over again. As the days passed, Sasha began to feel the walls closing in. Her moments with Daisy became more supervised, more structured. Every cry, every skipped nap became a footnote in the growing case against her. She would wake in the night and check the locks, certain that someone, maybe Carly, maybe the courts, was going to walk through the door and take Daisy away. Her mind grew foggier, her anxiety sharper, and her temper shorter. The loving mother who had once stood bravely in court and confessed to her lies in order to protect Daisy now felt like a shell. A puppet being pulled apart by forces she couldn't control. The line between paranoia and reality blurred. And Carly didn't stop there. Behind closed doors, she worked with Diane, gathering documentation, expert witnesses, and evidence that framed Sasha's recent behavior as erratic. She referenced Sasha's nightmares, her quiet breakdowns, her moments of withdrawal, building a compelling argument that Michael's custody of Daisy should be exclusive and absolute. Carly's mission was rooted in what she believed to be love, but to Sasha, it felt like an exorcism, an erasure of everything she had rebuilt. And Michael? Caught in the middle, he tried to tread carefully, but every hesitation, every failure to defend Sasha with conviction, deepened the fracture. Soon, Sasha was no longer just fighting for custody, she was fighting for her sanity. Alone in her apartment, she would stare at Daisy's crib and imagine the courtroom. The judge's cold stare, Carly's voice dripping with feigned concern. She began to hear whispers in her head, old echoes from the past, voices she thought she'd silenced. She tried to suppress them, to push through for Daisy, but the stress became unbearable. One morning, she forgot to take her medication. Another day, she didn't recognize the social worker visiting for the routine check. These small cracks became the foundation of Carly's case. But perhaps the most devastating moment came when Sasha overheard Michael and Carly speaking quietly on the patio. Unaware that she stood on the other side of the door, she heard Carly say, "She'll break, Michael. You just need to hold the line. For Daisy's sake." And she heard Michael say nothing at all. Not a defense. Not a word. That silence shattered her. What followed was a breakdown so quiet, so intimate, that no one noticed it except Sasha herself. She walked through the house like a ghost, performing motherhood like a routine, her eyes vacant, her soul hollow. She began to believe what Carly said. That she wasn't enough. That she was dangerous. That maybe, just maybe, Daisy would be safer without her. And that thought, more than any legal document or cross-examination, was the true cruelty of the ultimatum Carly had issued. Because it didn't just strip Sasha of custody. It stripped her of the very belief that she was worthy of being a mother at all. And so, the madness crept in. Not in a storm of violence, but in quiet desperation. Sasha began writing letters to Daisy, just in case. She locked herself in the bathroom for hours, trying to rehearse what she might say in court. How she might convince a judge, or herself, that she still mattered. But each passing day, the dream faded. And Carly's shadow loomed larger. Not just as a mother-in-law, but as a force that had become judge, jury, and executioner. The battle for Daisy was no longer just legal, it was existential. And Sasha was fighting it with bruised hands and a breaking heart. Michael had always prided himself on being a man of clarity and control, but lately, both were slipping through his fingers like sand in a storm. His heart was moving him toward Sasha, toward a future where they could finally be a family, complete with Daisy in their arms and a second chance at the life they were once cruelly denied. After months of grief, separation, and unexpected revelations, it felt like fate had come full circle. Sasha, pregnant with his child, now the mother of Daisy, had returned to his orbit with quiet strength and vulnerability. Michael saw her resilience not as a liability, but as proof of the kind of partner and mother she could be. He wanted that. He wanted her. But that desire had lit a fuse he couldn't put out, and now it was threatening to blow apart everything around him. At the heart of the storm stood Carly, ever vigilant, ever protective, her instincts sharpened like blades. Her disapproval of Sasha had once been veiled behind strained politeness, but now it rang out louder with each passing day. Carly believed Michael was moving too fast, giving too much, and trusting too blindly. To her, Sasha's past wasn't a chapter to be forgiven, it was a blueprint of risk. Carly didn't just question Sasha's ability to be a stable partner. She questioned whether Sasha's emotional instability could unravel the delicate progress Michael had made in the aftermath of his custody win against Willow. That doubt had transformed into a quiet but suffocating campaign of warnings, tension, and interference. Sasha, for her part, felt the shift acutely. Every time she entered the room, Carly's eyes seemed to follow, measuring her silences, her parenting decisions, her expressions. What was once subtle had grown overt. Carly no longer hid her skepticism, she embraced it. And Sasha, though trying to remain composed, was beginning to feel the weight of judgment in every breath she took. Her every effort to bond with Wiley and Amelia was now laced with an invisible tension, Carly's shadow lurking behind the innocence of each moment. Michael, caught between two women he deeply cared for, found himself in an impossible bind. On one hand, he saw in Sasha a future he wanted to reclaim. A version of himself that still believed in forgiveness and rebuilding. On the other, Carly was a cornerstone of his world, his confidant, his defender. The one who had stood by him through losses too immense to count. But now her loyalty had transformed into a form of control. Her constant warnings about Sasha's fragility. Her late-night calls filled with concern, her subtle reminders of the past, all of it was beginning to feel like a noose tightening around his decisions. What made matters worse was that Carly had begun to weaponize her influence not just emotionally, but legally. She had begun encouraging Michael to consider preemptive custody filings. To secure himself against future instability for Daisy's sake. She suggested evaluations, background reviews, and whispered that love, while noble, wasn't a substitute for safety. Her every word implied that Michael wasn't thinking like a father, he was thinking like a man in love. And love, Carly believed, made people blind. Michael tried to reason with her. He reminded her of Sasha's growth, of her therapy, of the strides she'd made since her darkest days. He pointed out how well she cared for Daisy. How the baby's laughter returned the light to their fractured home. But every time he defended Sasha, Carly countered with what-if scenarios, worst-case endings, and unspoken fears. The gap between mother and son began to widen, subtle but undeniable, as Carly's opposition grew more adamant. This growing rift placed Sasha in an unbearable position. She wanted peace. But she refused to shrink herself for Carly's comfort. She tried to engage gently, to meet Carly halfway, but her efforts were met with condescension and suspicion. Eventually, the tension boiled into sharp confrontations, icy dinners, interrupted conversations, and silences too loud to ignore. Sasha began to wonder whether Michael's dream of unity was just that, a dream. And yet, Michael remained firm in his desire. He wanted a life with Sasha, a family with Daisy, a healing of wounds too long left open. But the road to that future was becoming increasingly treacherous. Carly's interference wasn't simply about concern, it was about control. And Michael was beginning to see that the more he leaned into Sasha, the more he risked alienating the woman who had always seen herself as his protector. The question that now haunted him wasn't just about Sasha's readiness, it was about whether his loyalty to her would cost him the very foundation of the family he had always fought to preserve. As emotions reached a breaking point, the house that once felt like a sanctuary now throbbed with tension. Carly's disapproval wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was a force strong enough to destabilize the fragile peace Michael had forged. And unless a new path emerged, one built not on ultimatums but understanding, the dream of becoming a family might collapse under the very weight of love itself. Sasha was no longer the quiet, grieving woman who had once been dismissed as broken, unstable, or unfit. She had risen from the wreckage of addiction, the shadows of trauma, and the cruel misjudgments that followed the loss of her son. But now, as the legal system declared Michael the sole guardian of Daisy, Sasha found herself stripped of what mattered most, her connection to her daughter. It wasn't just a court ruling, it was a shattering indictment of her soul, a silencing of everything she had rebuilt. And she refused to accept it. Her world narrowed to a single mission, to reclaim Daisy, to prove to the world, and to herself, that she was more than her past, that she was, and always would be, Daisy's mother. What had once been a quiet plea for compassion became a full-fledged campaign of legal retaliation and personal defiance. Sasha threw herself into the fight, working with a fierce new legal team who promised results instead of apologies. They didn't care who Michael was, who Carly influenced, or what Willow had whispered behind closed doors. Sasha wasn't interested in revenge, she was interested in justice. The papers she filed weren't designed just to restore her rights, they were a declaration that she would no longer be erased. She requested supervised visitation at first, just to hold Daisy again. But as the evidence began to mount, of her sobriety, her therapy, her support network, she pushed for joint custody. She was determined not to be relegated to the fringes of her daughter's life, not while Carly maneuvered behind the scenes and Michael wavered in the middle. The courtroom became a battlefield. But the emotional war was waged far beyond legal arguments. Carly, sensing the threat Sasha posed, began painting a narrative behind the scenes, feeding doubt into Michael's mind. reminding him of Sasha's spirals and Nina's manipulation. She viewed Sasha as a threat not only to Daisy, but to the fragile structure of family loyalty she'd spent decades maintaining. Carly began confronting Sasha directly, issuing veiled threats under the guise of maternal concern. But Sasha didn't blink. She saw through Carly's need for control. Her refusal to let Michael make choices without her blessing. What Carly saw as maternal instinct, Sasha saw as domination, and she refused to let Daisy grow up with that kind of influence unchecked. The stress rippled outward. Michael, torn between loyalty to Carly and his growing guilt over denying Sasha her child, became increasingly conflicted. He had never intended to cut Sasha out completely, he only wanted what was best for Daisy. But the storm that followed proved impossible to contain. Carly accused him of being manipulated. Sasha accused him of weakness. And Daisy, too young to understand the politics swirling around her crib, became the quiet center of a war no child should ever be part of. Every moment became a test. Every handoff between parents was a cold transaction laced with tension. Sasha remained composed, never giving the court a reason to doubt her. But the fire inside her raged. She hired private investigators to dig into Michael's recent decisions, especially his increasing reliance on Carly for parental support. She questioned his emotional availability and whether his alliance with Willow, his ex-wife, created confusion in the home. Her team crafted arguments around emotional manipulation, around Carly's boundary violations, and the destabilizing impact it might have on Daisy's long-term development. Meanwhile, Sasha began attending community parenting groups, re-establishing herself publicly as a mother in control of her narrative. She gave interviews about recovery, parenthood, and the stigma of mental illness. She shared how holding Daisy brought clarity to her mind and calm to her spirit. Her story began to resonate with other mothers in Port Charles, women who had fallen, been judged, and climbed their way back to grace. And while Carly fought to discredit her, Sasha found herself with something more powerful than strategy, she had community. But it wasn't easy. There were nights Sasha broke down, clutching a stuffed toy Daisy once held, replaying courtroom testimonies that painted her as dangerous. There were mornings she stood outside the courthouse, fists clenched, refusing to be swallowed by anxiety. Her dreams of Daisy laughing, of bedtime songs and birthday parties, refused to be snuffed out. She saw that little girl in every room she entered. A living reminder of why surrender wasn't an option. Sasha wasn't fighting just for visitation. She was fighting to protect Daisy from a future of conditional love, divided loyalties, and whispered judgments. And though Michael tried to maintain peace, the conflict grew unbearable. He began to question whether Carly's protective instincts were tipping into control, whether Sasha's pain had transformed into clarity. In private moments, he saw how Sasha's love for Daisy hadn't faltered, it had crystallized. And though he still bore scars from their past, he found himself wondering whether denying Sasha now would scar Daisy in ways no custody order could prevent. As the next court date approached, all eyes turned to the drama unfolding in Port Charles. Was Sasha about to reclaim her place as Daisy's mother? Would Michael risk defying Carly and aligning with the woman he once loved? Or would the legal system once again favor structure over soul? History over healing? In the heart of the storm, Sasha stood ready, weathered, tested, and unbreakable. This was no longer about rights. It was about truth. And the truth was that no matter how far they pushed her, Sasha would never stop fighting for Daisy.